Hi everyone, my name is Mikhail Rodin and this is Прошлое channel, which means the past, and the Paleosurface project. Here we are talking about millennia that literally laying under your feet. I recently filmed in Armenia. Currently, excavations in this region show us how Neolithic agricultural technologies spread across Eurasia. And this season, very rare and still unclear burial of a child was excavated there. In the beginning of the video, I remind you that our channel exists on private donation. You can support us if you want to receive regular news from the frontiers of historical research.
Welcome to the Masis Blur Neolithic Settlement. It's called Masis because the nearest town is located right behind us to the south, and Blur is the Armenian word for a mound. This used to be a mounded site. Until the early 70s, it was an anthropogenic mound. Anthropogenic means it was created by humans rather than natural depositional processes. The site dates to the Neolithic period or the New Stone Age, which is about 8,000 years ago, from 5400-5300 BC to 6,000 or 6,200 BC. And this is the first time where we find in the region of the Southern Caucasus, so the countries of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, Neolithic settlements, so first sedentary agricultural pastoral societies of the region. There are only three sites known from Armenia so far. The Masis Blur being one, Akhnashen and Aratashen are sister sites being the other two. We know that all three sites were established on what used to be a paleo lake, on the shore of the paleo lake, which has since receded and left quite a marshy environment afterwards. Most of the marshes have now dried up as well, and what you see is just the Ararat plain around. What do we find here? We find the remnants of the very lively 1,000-year-old or 1,000-year-long Neolithic occupation here. And we know that because we do test pitting, what's called test pitting. We excavate in a small area very quickly until we get to virgin soil or the first geological deposit, and we can establish how far down the cultural layers go below the modern soil. And we do know that at Masis Blur, after the destruction of the mound, which would have been about 3 or 4 meters high, there is still about 3 meters of cultural occupational layers below the site. In the trenches behind me, we're at about 115 centimeters below the ground. So we know that there is another 1.5 meters, more or less, below this layer. What we're excavating here dates to 5,995 BC, so 6,000 BC, almost 8,000 years ago, and we are excavating an open-air courtyard. You can see Chloe here has been excavating down a fragment of a wall that was surrounding a large collection of hearths and fire pits, which we have since excavated out, and we're going lower and lower to an earlier occupational phase. But you can see two more fragments of walls emerging over there, which are older than the wall that's being excavated out here. We had more fire pits. This courtyard was just filled with fire pits, basically, and a few middens, which is their trash bins, where all their household refuse is disposed of. You can't see them, we've excavated them out, but we had, at some point in this layer, we had 13 different hearths and fire pits. Why would they need so many? I can't tell you, but we are finding that this seems to be a pattern throughout the site. We have uncovered this during the similar time period. Two more courtyards were excavated to the north of us in other trenches, and the picture was much the same. It's an open-air courtyard surrounded by short sort of protective walls, which are enclosing a whole collection of fire pits that are very closely built together. The more detailed analysis of the materials we've been finding, so more detailed analysis of the soil as well, have shown that they keep a very clean household. All of the materials we find come actually from the hearths and the fire pits. They cleaned their floors really well. The floor surfaces have no materials, or hardly any materials. So the carbonized grains that we find, like wheat and barley and lentils, the faunal remains, the animal bones that we find that they ate and then disposed of, are all coming from the hearths and the middens. Very, very clean society, very clean household, which is very interesting because it gives us a very unique insight into their thought processes, right? Like, we do the same thing today. We wake up, we clean the house, we eat, and then we dispose of the food in the proper place. We don't just toss it around. So it's interesting to see that pattern continue, which makes sense. Of course, we're people, we don't want to make a mess where we live. But it is interesting to have that kind of detailed insight for an 8,000-year-old settlement.
It may sound simple, unearthing a Neolithic settlement and reconstructing its structure. But people in this region at that time built houses from clay, which eventually became buried under layers of dirt. Experienced archaeologists can recognize the contours of ancient constructions by differences in soil color and texture. This skill is an essential part of training future specialists.
And you can see, if you come here, you'll see, like, as this crumbles away, the exterior of the wall is becoming obvious. It's not very clear here because this is much higher, but once you lower this, the face will be clear. And here it's just falling apart. I don't have to do anything. And you can see the deposit has a lot of ash in it, a lot of charcoal fragments, whereas the wall is more, as you've excavated and seen, it's a solid block of this yellowish clay. You can see there's already a pattern of rocks beginning to emerge. You have one there, two here, another one here. It's quite possible that we will have more of it. So you just be mindful, and we leave the rocks in place until we see what's below. We don't know how big the site would have been at a time. We don't know how large the village would have been. In order to do that, we would have to have a very large exposure, right, which would help us establish the boundaries of the site. But also the site settlement, just like cities, are not, modern cities and towns and villages are not static things. They aren't frozen in time. They shrink and expand as the population grows and population decreases. So over the course of more or less 1,000 years of occupation, we know that the site would have the settlement inevitably gotten bigger and smaller. So it's hard to determine the site's boundary. We excavate in arbitrary trenches, so we just for controls, to help us understand where materials coming out of, and so that we can connect the different layers to one another. And understand a general. We know that their houses were circular. We know that they built houses out of compacted mud. They were of round plan architecture, and they were quite small, actually. What we have excavated, frankly, so far, they're about 1.5 meters to 2 meters in diameter, which is not very large. The interior space of the house is quite plain. We find no architectural elements inside, but the open courtyard areas, what you see behind me, is very rich. There are always numerous hearths and fire pits, which they would have used for cooking and keeping warm. There are middens and various household structures that would have been used for storing grains, storing various tools, and their materials of everyday life. They're a typical Neolithic agricultural society. So we find grains that actually we find today, that we eat today. We find wheat, and they were growing wheat and barley and lentils and peas, chickpeas. They were practicing animal husbandry. The vast majority of the animal bones we find here belong to sheep and goat. During the later phases of the occupation, we begin to see some cattle and pig. But they were also utilizing all the resources around them, right? It would have been a marshy environment, potentially not too far from a receding lake. So we also find a lot of water resources like water birds and turtles and fish bones, lots of fish bones as well. We know that the turtles, they probably not only ate, but the carapace, the turtle shells that we see, they used for making pigments and probably paints, because we found a lot of them have this reddish pink pigment still stuck to the surface of the interior of the shell. We find a lot of bone tools. They made bone tools that they would have used for weaving, basketry mostly, and working animal hide, probably for making clothing, and various storage jars. The site doesn't have any pottery. They knew of clay, they knew of pottery. We find imported pottery fragments at the site, and the latest phases of the occupation do begin to have pottery, but the earliest layers that we're excavating right now are pre-pottery. So before they started using pottery. I don't want to say invention, because they knew what pottery was, and I think it was a very conscious choice not to make pottery for whatever reason. We find a lot of obsidian tools. Obsidian is a type of volcanic glass that is abundant in Armenia. We have many sources throughout the country. And we know that they were at Masis Blur, the inhabitants were utilizing sources as close as the Arteni source, which is about 45 kilometers from here, but also going really far out for some of the obsidian. And we have obsidian fragments that ended up here from as far as 350 kilometers away. So the agriculture that they practiced was rain-fed agriculture. They did not have irrigation. They weren't bringing water from anywhere. They were probably collecting fresh water from the springs and potentially rainwater for drinking and cooking, but they were not bringing water in from anywhere. So we have moved over what we call an excavation unit or a trench, but it's an arbitrary line, of course, that we draw right for ourselves to have a better control of where artifacts are coming out of. But this is a continuation of the same area that we were just in right now. This would have been part of the same large open courtyard area. And here, what we have found is a very different picture from what we had over there. We have what seems to be an in situ, well-preserved workshop area, where we find in their original locations all the groundstone implements, the obsidian tools, their version of knives that they would have found, some faunal fragments. Actually, we've also excavated some beads that came out just a couple of days ago. So the whole array of artifacts just in the original location as people would have left it behind. It's one of the rare instances where we find things in situ in their original context. And I'll just pick a few up to show you. These are the obsidian tools we talk about. This was their version of the Swiss Army knife. It did everything. It was used for cutting grasses. It was used for working animal hide, for harvesting grains. So this is not just a fragment of obsidian, but it is a very specific tool that they made with a purpose in mind, with function in mind. We also have stone implements that we call ground stone. They're harder, more robust, usually made from basalt or pumice. Both are stone types that occur locally. This is a very neat pumice tool. Probably was used for smoothing things. I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but it's. We also have the beginning of what would have been an axe head. This would probably have been attached to with cord and roping made from the reeds that grow around the site abundantly today, to a wooden handle shaft for hacking. And this one is quite well worn and used. We can see flakes have fallen off, have been removed from both sides. We have something here. Actually, this is one of the more rare tool types, but it is their version of a drill. This would have been used for making holes in things, for puncturing, both possibly animal hide, and this type of artifacts would have been used for making beads, drilling holes in little beads or pendants that then could be strung around a string. I'm going to just show you a very few select artifacts, but it's kind of a good representation of the types of materials we're finding here, just so you get a sense of the material culture that was created by the first sedentary inhabitants of the Ararat plain. And just so you can see the high level of scale. When we say 8,000 years ago, people usually think very rudimentary, very basic, maybe not very interesting, but these were people just like you and me. They liked pretty things, if you will. They probably met and fell in love and had families and created beautiful things that were both functional and ornamental. These two right here are large obsidian blocks, are known as obsidian cores. These are the forms that they would have used for creating the obsidian blades that we saw earlier in the trenches. They would hit with a much harder rock over here, something like basalt, to take off an obsidian blade, a long, narrow, and oftentimes very systematic and even fragment that would have very sharp edges. Then they would have used it, modified it to suit their needs, whether it was cutting grasses, harvesting grains, or working hide or creating bone tools. We see only two. This is what we've excavated between yesterday and today, so we don't have a huge variety of bone tools here at the site, but we do have a good representation of the kinds of stuff that they're making. These are made probably from cattle ribs, and these are long bones of maybe sheep and goat. This tool is called an awl. It's used for puncturing things, and we've seen another version of this in a stone tool in the trenches, and this is the bone artifact. This is probably, we call it a scraper polisher. You can see the edges are very beautifully worked and very, very worn and polished from repeated action, mostly probably used on hide, animal hide. We have a collection of beautiful beads that they made from various stones, and you can see some of them here. I don't know how clearly visible these are, but they are of different forms from different stones. and different things. We also have a couple of axe heads similar to the ones we saw in the excavation units, done to a different skill level, right? This seems to be more ornamental. It's beautifully made, it's well made, it's polished on both sides, and it has these notches that are not natural to the stone. These were created by the person who made the axe head, and this is so finely made that it's kind of hard to believe that this would have been functional, although it could have been. Whereas this one is more rugged and it has good use wear patterns, which means it was used probably for chopping down wood. And the last thing that we excavated just earlier today is this very small bead, and I can take it out. I don't know how easy it would be to see this, but this is made out of a stone called steatite. This is a very soft type of stone, easy to work with. It's a local stone, and these things are entirely too small for us to find very easily if we had very coarse grain excavations. If we were excavating here with shovels and pickaxes, we would never find any of this. So you see that the trowels we use, the very careful, very slow, very painstaking excavations, but it's that kind of excavation technique that allows us to find objects that are this small, which allow us to reconstruct a fuller picture, right, of the kinds of materials that they made and the kind of day-to-day activities that they would have undertaken. This is the highlight of our excavation season. A bioarchaeologist from UCLA, Dr. Campbell, is excavating the second burial we have found at Masis Blur, and it's the third known burial from a Neolithic site in Armenia, so it is quite a unique, rare, and exciting find for us.
So here we have this small circular structure. We originally thought it might be connected to this burial of this infant here. We are still trying to understand the relationship of the structure with this infant, but you can see it's a small circular area. We had a few artifacts inside, some ground stone, an animal bone, and a few other things. But here we have the body of an infant, so you can see the head is here. And then some of the ribs are here, and then the leg is on the other side of the structure. So we are trying to understand if this was built right on top of the infant at the same time, or perhaps later and they didn't realize that the infant was here, or they just built it on top anyways. But we will excavate more inside of the structure to try to understand if there are any more artifacts. And then once we have excavated inside, we will also remove the structure so that we can excavate the infant bones as well. You can see that they are damaged. They are, of course, very old, but also there are little field mice and foxes that run around and move the bones a little bit as well. So they move some of the smaller pieces, but otherwise the preservation is not too bad. There are other Neolithic burials from this time period where they have a round structure built on top of the body. Only a few. We don't have too many burials from this time period. But if it was a fireplace, you would expect more evidence of ash and burning and things like that. And we're not finding any of that. We found a few stone tools in here, but nothing that suggests that there was any burning in here. But their houses were also round. So it's maybe not surprising if their burial structures were round also. Very difficult to determine the biological sex of an infant before they get older and hit puberty. So unless we do DNA analysis, we will probably not be able to tell if it's a male or a female. But so far, all we can really say is that it is very small, probably less than 1 year. And once we excavate it, I'll look more closely at the bones to determine if there's any sort of trauma or disease or anything like that that we can see. It's often difficult though. These remains are very old, they're broken. It can be quite a challenge to get detailed information.
Thanks to these excavations, we are now beginning to understand not only the economy and daily life of Neolithic people, but also the complex cultural and genetic links between Middle Eastern and Caucasus societies. The combination of classical archaeological methods with modern technologies is opening up new insights into these connections.
There's both direct and indirect evidence in terms of links with Mesopotamia and other neighboring societies that were in the region. There's the imported pottery. We find fragments of what is called halafware. We find them. It's very finely made, beautifully painted pottery that has come to us only in small fragments. And it sort of is evidence of either direct or indirect contact with the societies who are producing them. But also in the more recent years, ancient DNA analysis has begun to shed some light about what form these relations and interactions would have taken. And what I mean by that is in 2014, we excavated a human burial from the site. And we sent some samples to Harvard for an ancient DNA analysis, and the results came back as the person who was, this particular individual had both local Caucasus hunter-gatherer DNA and this is the same DNA that is present in modern-day Armenians who are living in the region and abroad, but also part of his DNA had Mesopotamian, Anatolian ancestry, which means at some point immigrants probably, or people migrating to the region, intermarried with the local population and had children. So we find that's part of that DNA and part of that connection here at Masis Blur.